Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Furman, for being here with us today. I know you've weighed in the past, shifting gears for a moment, on changing the minimum wage and on bills addressing the so-called living wage. It has been suggested by some that we might, at some point in the near future, see movement of such a bill in the Senate. And so I wanted to talk to you about an article that you wrote in 2006, in June of 2006, in Slate, where you said that you would ignore efficiency and the impact on employment of the minimum wage for purposes of the article's argument, while noting that at $10 or $15 an hour minimum wage, ignoring those same factors would be, as you put it, quote, a terrible assumption. Can you explain what efficiency and employment factors might exist there, and why it would be a quote-unquote terrible assumption to think that a $10 or $15 an hour minimum wage might not impact these?
Sure, Senator, and glad you've gone back and read that more recently than I have. But the issue with the minimum wage is that there have been a range of studies that have found that raising the minimum wage in the range of what we've seen before does not have an adverse effect on employment, and that's because the extra cost to a company is outweighed by the benefits in terms of reduced turnover, better motivation, attracting workers, and the like. The levels of the minimum wage one is most comfortable with are ranges that we've seen in the past in terms of a level and an increase. I think it's important to understand that I was writing in 2006. There's been inflation since 2006, so whatever numbers I have in that article there, if you're thinking about 2016, which is when many of these bills would be fully affected, you want to take those numbers and take them up by 20 or 25% in order to have an apples-to-apples comparison. So I certainly wasn't commenting on a $10 minimum wage in the year 2016. I was commenting on it in the year 2006.
Sure. Yeah, I understand that. And I also understand we've had relatively low inflation since then, so wouldn't it be fair to say that the corresponding numbers might be, say, $12 to $18?
Well, the effective date for a lot of the minimum wage proposals is around 2015 or 2016, so there would be a decade between what I wrote and then. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I would have thought it would be about 20% inflation over the course of that decade, but okay. I could obviously look that up and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. In your testimony, while writing about lower health care costs, you indicated that in the short run, lower pressure on employee compensation would translate to job growth. So all else being equal, would a higher minimum wage, say a $10 minimum wage, be a policy that would make it more likely to increase employment numbers, to put more Americans back to work?
Right. The difference is that there are two sides of the ledger when it comes to the minimum wage. On the one hand, it's an extra cost, but on the one hand, it's also an extra benefit in terms of higher productivity, retention, motivation, all of those factors. And the empirical work finds that those two factors roughly balance it out, and as a result, there isn't a significant adverse effect on employment. In contrast, paying extra for health insurance is really just a cost to a company, and it's not, everything else being equal, of any benefit to the worker, so it doesn't have that corresponding other side.
Okay. In that same piece that you wrote for Slate, you stated that while supporting the minimum wage absent other policy changes, you would prefer other policies because they tend to be more progressive, paid for disproportionately through taxes on the wealthy, on upper income individuals, rather than through higher prices that might be passed along to consumers. In a piece on the minimum wage for the New York Times this March, former CEA Chair Christina Romer made a similar point, stating that it might be the case that, quote, businesses pass along some of the cost of a higher minimum wage to consumers through higher prices. Often the customers paying those prices, including some of the diners at McDonald's or the shoppers at Walmart, have very low family incomes. Thus, this price effect may harm the very people whom a minimum wage is supposed to help. Is it in fact likely, in your opinion, that consumers would foot the costs of a higher minimum wage?
I think it's a relatively small portion of the cost for those businesses. I think the minimum wage adjusted for inflation is today the same value it was in 1950, hasn't gone up in 63 years. And so I think there is certainly scope for an increase, and I think that would complement policies like an expanded earned income tax credit.
Okay, I see my time's expired, but I understand you to be acknowledging that some of this would be passed on to consumers.
No, I apologize, Senator, but I think it actually is part of a strengthening of the economy to put more purchasing power in the hands of families, and I think that would help the economy overall and help consumers more broadly.
Wish we had more time to talk about that.
Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I can